Have you ever noticed that everything suddenly starts to work out exactly when you let go of the situation and stop worrying? It seems like a paradox, doesn't it? Throughout our lives, we've been told, set goals, fight, don't give up. But what if the truth is the opposite? What if it's precisely our attachment to expectations, people, and outcomes that becomes the anchor weighing us down in relationships, at work, and even in the search for inner peace? Carl Jung, one of the geniuses of psychology, revealed an uncomfortable truth. The more desperately you try to control everything, the faster life slips away. Today, we will analyze why the ability to let go might be the only path to true freedom. Stay until the end. A single shift in perception can transform everything. And if you wish to delve deeper into self-knowledge, consider subscribing to our channel for more reflections like this. We cling to the idea of how things should be, and it's at that exact moment that life seems to, on purpose, destroy everything. What should support us turns into a source of anxiety. But as soon as we relax our control, reality seems to breathe a sigh of relief. Jung spoke about this directly. What you chase escapes. What you accept transforms. This paradox is at the core of inner transformation. Our society raises us in the spirit of a never-ending race. Tranquility is always somewhere on the horizon, but it's precisely this obsessive quest to control everything that prevents change. Letting go isn't about passivity. It's about a transition from anxious tension to conscious observation. Jung, while studying the shadows of the human soul, observed, as long as we are fascinated by images, by a brilliant career, by an ideal love, we are blind to who we really are. The desire for success is normal, but the problem begins when we identify with the results. If I am my work, my relationships, my status, then any failure becomes an existential threat. From there come fear, anxiety, and the attempt to control everything. Jung called this a vain attempt by the ego to preserve its illusions. But changes don't come when we tense up, but when we allow life to flow freely. Letting go doesn't mean giving up. It means making space for the new. It's not weakness, but a deep trust in what is beyond our control. When this happens, everything falls into place. Chaos acquires a logic, opportunities appear on their own, and worry is replaced by a strange calm. This is, finally, being present in your own life. Renouncing control is not renouncing a dream. It's renouncing the illusion that everything must be exactly as we planned. It is leaving the cage of I must and stepping into a space where other scenarios are possible, where you don't manage everything, but observe and consciously participate in life. True freedom is not in willpower, but in the flexibility of consciousness and the ability to say yes to what comes. But what if the problem isn't the person we are attached to, but the meanings we project onto them? Jung was categorical. We almost never get attached to people. We cling to our own projections, to the hope that the other will fill our internal voids, give us love, save us. We assign them roles they never accepted and suffer from the collapse of illusions. What we refuse to see in ourselves, we seek on the outside, sometimes idealizing, sometimes demonizing. It is this mirror of projections that generates pain. The ego tries to appropriate the external world as a child does with a toy. The fear of being unnecessary disguises itself as professional ambition. Dependency in relationships masks itself as romantic sacrifice. Often, our grand goals are just an attempt to fill an internal hole we are afraid to admit. But no one can eternally fit the role we've imposed on them. Illusions crumble, and disappointment remains. Jung saw this as a defense mechanism. Blaming the other is easier than facing the sides of ourselves we reject. But when we finally become aware of the projection, a true miracle happens. Reality begins to change. The other person becomes simply a person. It's not easy to say goodbye to illusions, but that's where honest contact begins. First with oneself, then with the world. And then you stop chasing an imaginary happiness and suddenly find yourself closer to yourself than ever before. Paradoxically, it is in the moment of letting go that a true connection with life, with oneself, with reality, occurs. Almost magically, everything starts to fall into place when we stop trying to control everything. Instead of effort, a space for conscious presence emerges. In this state, the connection to the world is not born from a desire to possess, but from genuine closeness. But when illusions crumble, the ego panics. It desperately clings to that which by its nature is impossible to hold. And here one must perceive the subtle difference between an internal direction and fear disguised as control. The first is trust, movement, and agreement with oneself. The second is tension, born from anxiety. We make plans, calculate moves, try to foresee all scenarios, hoping for security. But hyper-control is just an illusion. It's not a guarantee, but a way to avoid the unpredictable. The ego fears the unknown. Jung wrote, "Neurosis is always a substitute for legitimate suffering. Control becomes an anesthetic. Instead of feelings, strategies. Instead of honesty, escape. We hide behind actions, goals, and routines. We hope that total vigilance will protect us from the pain of simply being alive. But control is not life. It's a capsule, an imaginary refuge in which we renounce spontaneity, the freshness of the moment. And it is spontaneity that makes life real. Without it, relationships turn into a mechanical ritual, work into an obligation, days into a succession of exhaustion. Everything loses depth, color, and authenticity. The inflated ego is sacredly certain that everything must follow its model. There is only one correct way to live. Any deviation causes anxiety and guilt. The mind becomes overloaded, like a system with dozens of open windows. It can't cope. The result is psychic and emotional burnout. But this is not weakness. It is a natural consequence. The inner controller desperately defends against surrender, but surrendering does not mean losing. It's the recognition that not everything depends on our will. Jung perceived the unconscious as a living, autonomous force. It participates in shaping our lives, independent of the ego. By ignoring it, we get stuck in the trap of rationality, as if everything could be solved with logic. Giving up control means performing an act of trust, recognizing that even chaos has meaning. It's not a refusal of direction, but a consent to surprise, And yes, in a world where we plan even our breaks, this is an almost radical gesture. The more we try to predict everything, the further we move away from ourselves. But when we allow ourselves to simply observe without an immediate reaction, we begin to hear life. We realize it has a rhythm. It guides us even without a plan. Thoughts, feelings, silence. Everything acquires a different density. A sense of connection arises. What if freedom is not the power of the ego, but its flexibility? The moment when it surrenders and steps back, making way for the self. The self is the center of the psyche. It doesn't play a role. It doesn't wear a mask. It is who we are when we are no longer pretending. As long as the ego is in charge, we live based on external expectations. How should I look? What should they think of me? Renouncing these programs is not a regression. It's a movement towards the authentic. Jung called this individuation, the path to oneself through the union of the conscious and the unconscious. This is the maturing of the soul. This path begins discreetly, with small changes. Suddenly, you don't respond with the usual reaction. You realize you are not obliged to maintain an old role. After a loss, you don't immediately fill the void, but stay with it. In these moments, there is a portal. They don't bring immediate relief, but they open up depth. The true surrender happens when the ego admits, I can't do everything. And it is at that exact moment that silence is born within. This silence is not passive. In it, the self resonates. It does not demand. It simply is. It doesn't guide through commands, but through an internal response. Its voice is not logic, but meaning. It's not proof, but resonance. When we start to live from this depth, control is no longer necessary, like a crutch. It falls away on its own. Only clarity and trust remain. Such detachment is by no means passivity. It's a more subtle way of being in which you act without obsession, love without demanding, create without the need to prove anything. The source of motivation changes. Instead of a thirst for recognition, an internal integrity emerges. It doesn't need applause to exist. In the process of individuation, the ego doesn't disappear. It just steps back from its claims of absolute power to serve the self. Relationships become purer, decisions more conscious, and life ceases to be an arena of struggle and becomes a space for living. Letting go in this context is not a loss, but an integration. We allow what must go, and what is ready to manifest, to come. In this gesture, we are no longer a set of roles, but whole beings. But for the self to manifest, another boundary must be crossed, freeing oneself from the persona. In Jungian psychology, the persona is the mask we wear to be accepted by society. It is important, but it becomes a problem when we merge with it. When we live for an image, we lose connection with ourselves. The persona demands to be strong, successful, spiritual, and all this sounds beautiful, but it comes at the cost of constant vigilance. We get tired of the game, lose spontaneity, become strangers to ourselves. Jung saw the persona as a necessary but limited tool, a bridge between the internal and the external. However, if we forget that behind the mask there is something more, The mask begins to control us, not the other way around. The attachment to the image becomes a trap. The slightest threat causes panic. We no longer live, we just manage the impression we make. Liberation begins with a simple but radical awareness. We don't need to maintain a constant contradiction-free image. We can be different, make mistakes, change. Authenticity begins where the fixation on how others should see us ends, even if honesty is not pleasing. To shed the persona means to show oneself without armor. This requires courage. One must be ready to deconstruct the very image that was built over years. But it is precisely this step that liberates. It's as if you walk off the stage of a poorly acted play and, for the first time, take a deep breath. Now you are not an actor, but the author of your own words. Jung accurately said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakens." The persona is the sleep where we believe we are what we show. The awakening begins with recognition. The mask cannot contain the full complexity of our nature. Behind it hides what we fear to see, the shadow. Many want freedom, but few are willing to face it, because to be free is to have no shelters, not in people, not in roles, not in dreams. It means taking responsibility for everything, including what we were hiding. That's where the shadow lives, according to Jung, the repressed part of our psyche. The shadow is not necessarily something bad. It is what doesn't fit our ideal image and was therefore repressed. The more we deny it, the stronger it becomes. People often say they want freedom, but they fear what might come with it. The void, the silence, the loneliness. That's why they cling to relationships, jobs, dreams, not out of love, but out of fear. Because if all that disappears, it will become clear what we were really leaning on. Letting go doesn't just mean renouncing the external. It's also a step inward. What remains when desires are not fulfilled? What happens when relationships end? Plans fall apart. It is in this inner void that the shadow appears. It doesn't come gently. It can be anger, envy, melancholy, feelings we fear, but it takes courage to go through them without trying to embellish or run away. Jung said, "Enlightenment does not happen without encountering the darkness of the soul." And it is in this process that true transformation occurs. When we stop being afraid, not because we have become stronger, but because we recognize everything that exists within us. Only then does the real awakening begin, from the inside out, not according to a script. This is not a renunciation of life, but a return to its heart. When the shadow is recognized, it stops controlling us. We learn to accept the forgotten aspects of ourselves, the neediness, the fear, the vulnerability, not to submit to them, but to gain awareness of them. Then, letting go becomes not just a gesture of liberation from the other, but also an encounter with what we were taught to be ashamed of. The shadow is not an enemy, but part of the whole. Only those who have passed through it know the taste of inner freedom, which does not depend on external conditions. The shadow often manifests in relationships where we least expect it. We mistake for love what is, in fact, dependence, the desire to be with someone and the fear of being alone. The line between them is thin, but crucial. Jung said, True love begins where projections end. As long as we are in love not with the person but with their image, we see neither them nor ourselves. It is not a feeling, it is an expectation masked as attachment. In the initial phase, we tend to idealize. We attribute saving qualities to the partner, security, warmth, meaning, and we lose our boundaries. They are no longer a person, but the carrier of our projection. We think this is closeness, but it is actually fear. If the other leaves, I fall apart. This is how the dependency we call love is formed. But a love you cannot leave is not love. It is the fear of being yourself outside the relationship. When we let go of the projection, what truly exists remains. Love for the person, but also the honest recognition that we use them as a shield against our own unintegrated parts. Letting go does not destroy love, it purifies it. It is no longer a need for possession, but respect for the other's freedom. The possibility of being together not as a demand, but as a choice. Mature, conscious. One that does not cancel out individuality. This perspective requires a restructuring. Instead of seeking completeness in the other, we return to ourselves. Love without appropriation is not cold or distant. On the contrary, it is purer because it is not fed by fear. It is not fusion, but presence. Not dissolution, but interaction. We share our integrity without diluting it. Where projection ends, the true encounter begins, not of images, but of consciousnesses. Maintaining the mask, the image, the representations requires a colossal effort. There comes a time when controlling is no longer possible. What seemed like strength becomes a burden. The fatigue, which we perceived as physical, reveals itself to be an exhaustion of the ego. This is not weakness. It is a sign. The psyche says, I can't pretend anymore. And in this crack, something real begins to emerge, not with euphoria, but with an internal clarity of finality. Jung saw such crises as an invitation to truth. When the internal order collapses, a reconstruction on another level begins. Emotional burnout is not just overload, but the cry of the soul, tired of roles, too many expectations, too little authenticity. Maintaining the image requires infinite self-regulation. But when the body gives way and the mind freezes, it's not a failure, it's a call. Who am I without all this? At this moment, letting go doesn't become an escape, but a return. There is no longer a need to prove, justify, convince. One can simply be. The ego gets scared. If I don't hold on, everything will fall apart. But surrender here is not defeat. It is maturity. It is the recognition of limits and the refusal to continue through force. Jung knew the repressed psyche does not disappear. It takes revenge with symptoms. But when heard, it heals. The exhaustion from the mask is not a defeat. It is the beginning of truth. It's an invitation to take a break, to ask what really matters now, what I truly feel without the external framework. Sometimes all we need is to stop, not to disappear, but to reveal ourselves, to let go of the need to be someone and allow the real to manifest. When the mask falls, pain remains, but also the freedom of being alive without a role. There is a form of pain that is rarely spoken of. The grief for the loss of who we never were. Much is said about the freedom that detachment brings, but little about the internal death that accompanies it. This is not a metaphor, but a psychological fact. We experience the death not of events, but of hopes, of the projections of a future that did not happen. This grief is real. Jung considered suffering not a mistake, but a mandatory part of transformation. Without death, there is no rebirth, neither in the external nor the internal world. When plans are gone, an old love dies, an identity we no longer believe in crumbles. All of this hurts. Even if reason understands that it's for the best, the heart suffers. Letting go here is not an act of will, but a deep and irreversible experience. It leads us to a space of silence, doubt, vulnerability. We find ourselves in a void where the old supports no longer work. It is scary, but in it, something different, more alive, is already maturing. In the void, duality arises, relief and pain, loneliness and space, fear and curiosity. This is psychological grief, not just for the loss, but for how it should have been. The ego suffers for the unrealized script, demands explanations, a why. But the deep self, the self, works differently. Sometimes it is precisely failure, rejection, rupture that directs us inward, to a revision of values, to what was previously inaccessible. The respect for pain must be as great as the longing for freedom. Only by going through grief without denying it can we truly change. One should not get stuck in suffering, but one cannot pretend it doesn't exist either. The conscious experience of pain gives it shape, time, and an end. This is learning how to deal with losses that leave no visible marks but deeply wound the soul. And it is precisely in these invisible losses that a new life can begin. When what we were attached to dissolves, it is not the end. A restructuring begins. The silence that once seemed frightening becomes spacious. The void is not a failure, but a field where seeds germinate. What couldn't appear before, a creative impulse, tenderness, curiosity, now finds a place. It's like opening a window in a room that hasn't had air for years. The dust dances, the light changes. At first it's strange, but then, liberating, breath appears. Presence returns. We stop running and start listening. The body, time, sensations, everything sounds different. Imagine a person who was in a relationship for a long time out of fear, attachment, or habit. They let go not only of the other person, but of their own illusion. First, silence. Then, space. In that space, they suddenly want to write, cook, go for a walk. Not out of obligation, but out of fullness. It is the return to oneself through simple things. It is not productivity, it is spontaneous expression. Jung wrote that psychic energy is restored when we stop feeding the ego. Everything we once spent on the mask, control, and resistance to the present returns. This energy does not disappear, it transforms. From it, creativity is born, not just in art, but in being. Creativity is a different way of living, of feeling, of choosing. It doesn't start with action, but with space. As long as everything was occupied by fear, roles, efforts, there was no room for intuition. Now, it speaks louder. Where there was once anxiety, Clarity emerges. The answers come by themselves, not from reflection, but from feeling. The day no longer seems like a battlefield. Time ceases to be an enemy. Everything slows down but doesn't stop. It becomes closer to the rhythm of the soul, not out of laziness, but out of an internal agreement. The moment comes when a decision becomes easy, because you no longer need to prove anything. And what's surprising is that what once seemed unattainable begins to come to you, not by magic, but because you stopped getting in the way. Imagine an artist blocked by the fear of not being a genius. He exhausts himself trying to create something great and fails, until one day he gives up, steps back, rests, goes for a walk, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a living, spontaneous idea emerges. This is the power of letting go. What is genuine is born when we give it space. This state of free creativity, of contact with the authentic self, is completely opposite to the logic of the ego. The ego wants guarantees and control. The self seeks authenticity and harmony. When the ego relinquishes the center, the self gently takes the lead, not by forcing, but by guiding. It manifests in what brings you joy, even if no one sees or appreciates it. It is here that the act of letting go shows its true face, not as a loss, but as a transition between what was and what can be, between who you were in the search and who you become, simply by allowing yourself to be. The space that arises after letting go is not a frightening void, but fertile ground. It awaits your authentic presence. Life doesn't shout, it whispers. And when you quiet down inside, you begin to hear. It all comes down to a single gesture, that of an open palm, the refusal of obsessive scripts, fears, repetitive stories. This is not weakness, it is clarity. Sometimes the beginning is exhaustion, but we truly let go when we realize that holding on costs more than the loss. Attachment may seem like love, but it is often born of fear, the desire to hold on to something that has already served its purpose. Love is not control. It is allowing the other to exist, even if their path deviates from your expectations. Control is not strength. It is just sophisticated resistance. The ego wants to bend reality to its will, but this way of existing is a constant conflict, and no soul can endure a war against the present for long. Jung knew healing does not come through violence. It happens when we stop fighting and start listening. When we renounce the idea of how it should be and face what already is. Acceptance is not surrender. It is opening the door through which the real can enter. And here, perhaps, the most important question. What are you still holding on to? What image, what idea, what role still occupies a place inside you and prevents the new from arriving? What will happen if you let it go? Yes, letting go is a risk, but holding on also has its price. Sometimes it's not the changes that are scary, but remaining in captivity. We are not here to play a role. We are here to live, and life requires courage. The courage to discard the unnecessary. The courage to approach what is truly important. The courage to allow yourself to simply be. Life begins where the illusion of control ends. It is in this silent, intimate moment that we return to ourselves, not as an ideal, but as a presence. From this point on, everything that truly matters finds its own way. If these words resonated with you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications so you don't miss our next reflection on letting go, self-awareness, and Jungian psychology in everyday life. And if you made it to the end, show your commitment to this journey by writing in the comments, "I let go of what no longer belongs to me." That way, I'll know you've walked this path with me. See you in the next video.